Hi guys, welcome. My name's Jessica. I'm the Project Development Officer from Propel Youth Arts WA, and we're very proud to present our third art talk, Amplifier Art Talk, as part of National Youth Week. We've got a beautiful list of supporters and partners for this event and for National Youth Week that we would love to thank, given this opportunity to thank. So those are the Department of Local Government and Communities, who for the last 5 years have partnered with us for National Youth Week. DCA, obviously, is one of our core funders. Lottery West, the City of Perth and the City of Perth Library as our venue partner, and Cathedral Square as our venue partner as well. But as you guys walked in, there are some programs. Please pick up one on your way out if you haven't already. And there's a big page of the amazing organisations that we have a lot to thank for. We're very grateful too. In terms of the festival, if you guys haven't heard about it, National Youth Week is WA and in fact nationally the biggest celebration of youth and their impact on our society and our culture. It is a celebration of the things they offer. As part of that, we offer a lot of different events, forums to offer information, workshops. So we've had car maintenance workshops that have just existed. We've also got a making jewellery workshop coming up as well, which you can still register for. We've got a parade where you can get all fired up and tell us what you're passionate about and parade with the Snapcat girls. And of course we've got our festival day this Saturday, the 16th, where there's heaps going on in the Cultural Centre. So if you haven't heard of it, head on down, have some fun, celebrate youth, even if you're young at heart, or if you've got some little ones, bring them in as well. Cool. So tonight, though, we are here to talk about arts versus ethics, as we've named the conversation, with a little question mark at the end of it. The reason why we place that question mark on there is because, is it a competition between arts versus ethics? Can they coexist? Do they have to exist in competition? Where are the boundaries set? How do we set them? And that's what we plan to talk about tonight. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers tonight, so I'll just take a moment to introduce each of our panellists. So first up, to my right, we have Lyndall Adams. Until recently, Lyndall was the chair of the subcommittee for ethics. Hi guys, welcome, come on in. So until recently, yes, as I say, Lyndall was the chair for the ethics subcommittee at ECU, overseeing arts and performance studies. She was there for 3 years. Lyndall has also received, I'm ready, I have to take a breath, there's a lot here. She's received a BA with her first honours in 1997, a Master of Visual Arts in 1999, and a PhD of Philosophy in 2008 from the Southern Cross University in Lismore, New South Wales, where she also lectured in the School of Arts for over a decade. Lyndall is an arts practice-led researcher and an artist herself as well. She's participated in solo, collaborative and group exhibitions within Australia and internationally since 1995, and she's currently, I think, still represented by the art gallery in Dalkeith. Element?
Down, I think.
Oh, they've closed down.
Yeah.
Anyone now?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment. Up for offer. Next on, now we're not quite working along the line, I'm working down my page here instead, but we have Michael Tucak in the middle, in the blue jumper. Now Michael is the principal lawyer for Creative Legal, which is a specialist WA legal firm offering services across the arts and the creative industries, which include film, television, music, digital and multi-platform, visual arts, performance, design, fashion, innovation and startups. Michael has partnered with us before and had offered a forum last year as part of National Youth Week as well, talking about arts law, and answered a lot of questions for us then as well. So we're very excited to have him back. He's very passionate about the development of the creative capacity of Perth and Western Australia. We're looking forward to having you here. Thank you. Now we're going to cut back to Oron. So Oron is the director of SymbioticA, which he co-founded in 2000, I think that is. Which is the Centre of Excellence in Biological Arts, School of Anatomy, Physiology and Human Biology at the University of Western Australia. I'm sure you guys have heard of SymbioticA. If you haven't, you need to look them up. They're doing some incredible work there, and they have been since 2000, as we say. He's also a visiting professor of contestable design at the Royal College of Arts in London, and a visiting professor at the School of Art, Design and Architecture in Aalto University, Helsinki. So he's well travelled. He's an artist, designer, researcher and curator whose pioneering work with the Tissue Culture and Arts Project, established in 1996, is considered a leading biological art project. So far we're setting the bar very high, and it's just going to get better, guys, with Loren Kronemyer. So Loren is an internationally exhibiting artist from Los Angeles, California. Her work involves exploring across disciplines to pursue ideas of interspecies communication, ecological agency, and self-annihilation. She came to Perth in 2011 to work with the SymbioticA lab. So Loren knows our panellists tonight as well. It's good.
It's an inside job.
Yeah, that's it. And since then, she's worked with the scientific institutions such as the Centre for Sleep Science, Centre for Integrative Bee Research, Cell Central, and the WA Herbarium. Herbarium. Her artwork is featured by the Fremantle Art Centre, Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts, the Lawrence Wilson Art Gallery, Next Wave Festival, Proximity Festival, and Perth International Arts Festival. She's also currently working on a brilliant work with some other WA artists called the Ecosexual Bathhouse. Is that correct? So you guys should check out that work that's going on there as well. Type in a search and give you some more information about that. It's great new work.
Incognito browser.
And lastly, to complete our panel, we have Kelli McCluskey. Now, Kelli is an artist and co-founder of the tactical media art group PVI Collective, which was formed in 1998. Perfect cue, we've planned that one. If anybody has their phones switched on, please switch them off now. Or put them on silent.
Sorry.
It's fine. PVI produce interdisciplinary artworks that are intent on creative disruption of everyday life. Every artwork aims to affect audiences on a personal and political level and is geared towards instigating tiny revolutions. Kelli is a passionate advocate for live art and interdisciplinary art forms in Australia. She writes, devises, directs with PVI Collective, and kickstarted the artist-run initiative CIA Studios in 2008, which she co-manages. So, that's our panel. Let's give them a warm welcome to us. So, the idea is every time we do a panel, we find a panel of experts, and I'm sure that you guys can tell from that we've done pretty well this time. So, we're very excited. So, let's get into it. The first thing that I wanted to do is I think it's really important for the sake of tonight, and obviously this question alone could be something that we could spend hours trying to define, but for the sake of tonight, I think it's important that we define ethics. So, to do that, I'm going to kind of throw that open a little bit to you guys straight up. I do feel as though we may end up breaking it into a couple of different bite sizes that we can then discuss and pull apart as we go through. But yeah, if you guys can take a moment to help us define ethics. Yeah, maybe the lawyer, please.
Well, I was thinking about the topic and thinking that obviously ethics and laws are different things. They're trying to achieve the same end. They're trying to control behaviour or affect behaviour to certain outcomes. But I think the way that I would think about the difference between those two things is that ethics ultimately is morally based. There's a moral core of what we decide is ethical behaviour or unethical behaviour, whereas the laws might not necessarily go that way. There might be ethics for morally based reasons for laws, but it's not necessarily the case. There can be all sorts of things, commercial interests and so on. So I would start by putting that idea forward that it's a moral decision, a moral point that we're focusing on, things that drive up from there. That opens up others to add into that.
Can I prompt on that? Is that also something that's so morally that's decided by the community that's best represented by? So from culture to culture, the definition of ethics or somebody's morals would differ quite easily?
Yeah, definitely. I think all those moral codes are always going to be set by the group that's in considering them. So that even within a society, there will be differences in terms of what might be considered ethical in one area and different in the other. It is always going to depend on the context or the group that's considering it. You might argue that from a legal point of view, that's going to be the same. That there's different laws that will apply in different different groups will set different laws. But I think overall, with laws, we're looking much more society-wide. I don't think it's the same with ethics. Different ethical limits might exist in one group that won't exist in another within the same society.
Yeah.
I think you can drill down on that as well and just kind of really, I guess in a way, is a very personal set of decisions that you make when you're thinking about making, ethical or moral choices or decisions about your artwork or your practice. It comes back to you as an individual as to kind of where do you draw the line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think starting from an individual perspective is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, so you'll have a communal moral code or ethical code, and then you've got your personal ethical code that you need to clearly understand as an artist.
Yeah.
When you're representing a university, however, there's a whole other layer.
Mm.
Yeah, right.
You have to, when you conduct research as an artist in any form, you're usually dealing with participants, so you need to think about other things, like getting through the ethics application, which can be quite grueling at a university. One of the things that I try and explore is that notion of embodied ethics versus abstract ethics, so that when you're asking artists what they're actually going to do, it doesn't frighten the absolute guts of the project out of it, basically.
Could you give us an example of embodied ethics and abstract ethics?
Well, what we were talking about, that moral imperative, that very personal notion of how you conduct yourself in the world and what your limits are. But when you're dealing with your human research ethics committee, then there's this kind of paperwork trail that exists that seems to go on forever and doesn't seem to belong to that very personal notion. However, it is just paperwork. And it's looked at as this notion of an abstract ethics, that's something that's not actually connected to me. But if you approach ethics always from that very embodied position, it makes it much easier and more palatable to, some of the things that happen anecdotally at a university is I'll get these really passionate artists come in and suddenly they're doing interviews and focus groups. Because I think that's the only way they're going to get through the ethics application, rather than actually go out there and do what artists do.
Yeah.
And just work through it. And usually, once they're through it, it makes the work a lot stronger as well, because they've actually really had to think about that notion of abstract ethics, putting it on paper, what they actually do, what the ideas are.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think it's touching, and as I say, it's something that we could potentially spend the entire night talking about the definition of ethics. But while we're on this element and looking at the requirements from a university, a legal requirement, and then also setting it for yourself, can you all individually just touch on why tonight was important, why you feel that this conversation about ethics and making these definitions and sharing it is important to you?
I think we live in a time where ethics is becoming extremely important in the sense that the world that is around, the Panama papers, for example, is a great example of the fact that the world is controlled by unethical conduct. And as artists, we need to somehow deal with it in some way or form. So I think we can't separate. There was a notion that art is a pure kind of pursuit that is separate from ethics or politics, and I don't think we can say that any longer. And especially in the field that SymbioticA operates in, and that's what happens when new knowledge regarding to life is coming to application, and then how we're starting to deal with life in ways which we never culturally adapted to deal with. So there's this growing disconnect between what is happening to life on many different levels, and then how we as a society, we as a culture, think about life in general. So when I think about ethics, I also think about what I refer to as the zones of uncomfort. I'm really interested in kind of probing those very same areas that I feel uncomfortable about, because I know that those zones of uncomfort are exactly those types of ethical areas that need more cultural scrutiny. Now, without us as artists, with our special social contract that we have, probing into those questions, there's no one else who can do it. So in a sense, it's an extremely, and as our knowledge is increasing, as inequality is increasing, as the drive for monetary-based applications of knowledge is basically dominating the way we view the world, there is a place for people like us who are able to probe with the different agendas and try to highlight those areas that need more attention.
And in some ways, very docile. other areas.
In other areas, there are signs. That's right. Yes. So art plays, and actually art is playing, I think, the most important role that it played in the last 100 years or so, in being able to do it as the last bastion of this type of free thought.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. I mean, one of the reasons I was interested in participating tonight as well was actually looking at things from a funding and sponsorship perspective, and looking at the cultural landscape in Australia and how it seems to be following a similar trend to the UK. And when I talk about funding, I mean as emerging practitioners or people who have put in funding applications, you may be finding that we're constantly kind of boxed into this kind of profit-making business model type scenario, and that funding in itself, in Australia is incredibly has been destabilised hugely at the moment with the grandest heist of Australia Council monies, and I think the pattern of behaviour in the UK, there was a mandate that came down between 2011 and 2015 where the government requested the Arts Council to make 30% cuts and to encourage artists to focus on private sponsorship as a source of income. And I think in terms of thinking about ethics, this is really a key thing, because when you're pushed towards going towards private sponsorship, there are a whole can of worms that you need to kind of start thinking about in terms of, well, what ethical choices am I going to be making? Who will I approach? Is there such a thing as clean money in the private industry? Can artists make dirty money clean? All of these things start to kind of come to the fore, and I can kind of see that axe falling now in Australia, and heads rolling as on May the 9th, when the Australia Council announcement are made for small to medium arts, or those sectors that have gone for 4-year funding, which is kind of a big thing at the moment. There's going to be this huge kind of loss of creative organisations and individual practitioners who sought that funding, and where are they going to go to try to keep their practice going in terms of being funded and supported. So I guess I was really interested in kind of having that conversation tonight as well.
Maybe if I pick up the point about this being centred around morals, I think there's an issue of a conflict of some kind. There's always two different things that, or more than two, drawing someone in different directions. That's where the moral decision comes from, and that's where the ethics come into play. You've got two competing demands or controls on you that then cause that decision to be made. You've got to make a choice. Ultimately, I think that's where it's centred. There's always that duality or more of factors that cause the dilemma.
I would say, I guess coming from the point of view of my practice, I think that art is ethics in motion and in action, whereas, I know that there's this version of ethics, which is the institutional form and the legal form, and an idea that perhaps ethics is indexed to some sort of objective moral core, but I don't really see it that way. I think that it is very much an evolving dynamic, and much like art can't be disentangled from social or political or environmental ecologies that it arises in, the very same is true of ethics. And so I thought it was important to come and sort of reject the art versus ethics premise in the first place, which I'm sure you knew would happen within 5 minutes. So that's done now, out of the way. Now we can move on.
Although being contestable, I think that there's something quite dangerous also to talk about in this context, because it's really easy to move from this kind of conversation to a conversation about censorship.
Yes, it's slippery.
It's a very slippery slope. So we have to be aware that although art is engaged with ethics, that there are ethical conducts, we don't have any authority over artists in regard to tell them, we're not lawyers, we don't have our bar exams, we don't have a code of ethics for artistic conduct, and it's good that we don't have it. Because I think it would be really, really dangerous if we start to exclude artists, because someone would feel that their practice or their work is somewhat unethical.
Yeah, right.
There's other mechanisms that might be able to control it. One of them is basically just the common law. But if we start to figure out that there is a need to have like a ground body of funding bodies would start to engage in so-called ethical decisions with regard to what is funded and what's not, it's a very dangerous slippery slope. So it is art versus ethics as well.
Mm.
Yeah, in this context.
I would say that sort of, art is capable of engaging with ethics from an ambivalent stance or from either side of an ethical issue. And, the word ethics itself doesn't necessarily denote like the right ethics. It can, art and ethics can entangle in all of the various combinations of the two without necessarily mandating that art be good in the,
They're confronting the ethics of a particular piece. It's a very interesting one to look at.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think within the context of art, something that we need to remember that there's what I refer to as the ethics of deception. Yeah. As artists, we never signed any dotted line that the stories we tell are necessarily true or correct or whatever. So you can have an artist who would claim something which would, on its face, would sound extremely unethical, but actually it's a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to expose them as hoaxer or expose them as people who are not, it's not going to help, because really the story, the narrative is what's important. So in a sense, we also have to allow those types of narratives to take place as well. And sometimes it would come from a profoundly ethical stance, but on its face, the way it's being projected, it might be seen as a very unethical conduct.
I'm really interested in a notion as a part of human research ethics called beneficence. And that's about, basically it's about what is the benefit to the community. But that was changed not all that long ago, really, so that it was looked at as first do no harm, kind of the way the legislature, whatever it's for the people where it's written. But what is of benefit? Is it, should you be able to tell a narrative that's not true in order for that beneficence to happen? And that comes out of medical ethics, where they use placebos.
Mm-hmm.
So, it comes out of that. So I'm really interested in how we talk around, we've talked around the silences in our communities for a long time. We seem to have been very apathetic for a long time. And I think artists are just starting again to talk about some of the things that really matter. As Oron started talking about what it, because we do seem to have been shut down for a long time around funding, around, the Bill Hanson case shut a lot of work down. There's been a lot of media attention that has judged work through other political agendas. So I'm really interested in this notion of beneficence and what it is and how we can work with it by taking risks in our art practices. And how we enable everybody, in my capacity in university, obviously, to not water down what we're actually doing as artists, but also in my own practice, asking those questions of what I really believe in and whether I'm willing to take the risks and make that work.
It's very interesting when you fill out those ethics applications. We need to do it all the time. I'm completely institutionalized here, so I have to do this kind of stuff constantly. Which is kind of really interesting, because we don't have a specific ethics committee for performing art or for arts in general. We have to submit ethics application to the General Ethics Committee in UWA, which is still based on the Helsinki Convention, based on kind of the guidelines are actually being published by the NHMRC, the National Medical and Health Research Institute. So it's geared towards that. So the kind of questions that the artists need to answer in order to get ethics approvals for sometimes very intrusive procedures is quite amazing, but they also have to answer questions like how your work is going to benefit society, how those types of questions that artists may be believing that they're doing, but they never really needed to articulate until they have to convince a bunch of lay people, in the sense that what they're doing has some significance. And we often have those misunderstandings, because artists are using often humor and irony and other narrative, kind of other storytelling techniques, and sometimes they embed it in the ethics application. To such an extent, actually, we had an artist that was doing a project where she got people to donate their blood and get the white blood cells to fight against each other like a tournament, and see which one has a better immune system, in a sense. And the reason she did it, that she had an autoimmune disease, so she thought that her immune system is actually really strong, it's going to beat everyone else. And she made it as a tournament. But she was talking about notions of superiority of diseased person as opposed to a healthy person, racial, gender issues. which was very important as part of the story. But when it was put into an ethics application, the ethics committee just freaked out because they basically said it's a racist project, and it's and we had to submit it something like 5 times before we got approval. And at the very last application, we actually said a disclaimer was that this ethics application might still contain traces of irony. So,
How much of her project did she need to edit or change, or did she lose any of the essence of her work? Or?
no, I think to some extent it strengthened it.
Yeah.
And in a sense, to do with institutional ethics, I actually think about them as enablers rather than people who are trying to stop you from doing
Yeah.
things, because they let you do things that otherwise might put you in a very compromised situation. Like,
Yeah.
you know, if I come to you with a needle and draw your blood, it's an assault.
Yeah.
If I get an ethics application to do it, it's okay.
I agree with that. I mean,
Yeah.
we have a really great supportive board on TBI. Michael is one of them. And, you know, some artworks or ideas that we come up with. There was one a few years ago when CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, came to Perth, and the Queen was visiting, and we wanted to do an intervention on the day of the Queen's birthday. And we wanted to, I guess, in a way, bring to light some of the leaders of the Commonwealth who were descending on planet Perth, some of the darker facts about who these leaders were. And so we wanted to get to create this kind of card game whereby it was called CHOGM Who Cares, and you basically had to match the CHOGM delegate with the dirty deed. And some of the dirty deeds were really full on, like some accused of rape, others of kind of like, you know, falsely imprisoned people. There was these huge kind of like issues. And bringing that idea and talking it through with our board and having lawyers, you weren't on at the time, but and talking through that and actually using their expertise, like the expertise of an economist or of a lawyer, and finding loopholes, because, you know, they'd enacted the Police Special Powers Bill as well at that time, so there was heightened security, and actually working our way through finding a way to actually do that intervention with the support of people that do have that knowledge really made the work so much stronger and actually enabled us to do it without, you know, getting arrested. So that was really beneficial. Yeah.
So overall, the bodies at power, or, you know, the people that are there to enable us.
Well, they can.
You have to find a way to manipulate them to allow you to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Is that ethical? Very.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very ethical.
I think there's a fear around it, you know, that institutionalised ethics, which has been built up over a long period of time. People like Oron and myself are breaking that down, I hope. You know, by sitting on those boards and, you know, talking to people and talking people through that this is not, no, you don't have to go and interview someone. You know, you can actually go and draw blood and make unethical.
Yeah, but stopping artists from doing their art is way more unethical than, you know,
That's right.
maybe having a small
Yeah.
mistake of an artist.
Yeah, or making artists do interviews.
Yeah.
You know, it's just it's an enabling process. But and I have seen over a long period of time now that it does strengthen most processes. You know.
It requires you to think about it in ways that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah.
What questions are you asking?
Yeah.
What all sorts of
But I do resent the idea that, you know, at its core, art has to benefit society. And I know, I think playing that game, I'll play that, you know, that game with anyone, but I don't actually believe in that.
I actually just submitted an interview where I'm saying, you know, we're not here to save the world, we're not here to make the world a better place. There's other people who claim that. We have to actually figure out why they claimed it and try to, you know.
But what is it?
Does
Well,
it
That's like
fit with do no
beneficence
harm?
is, you know, it's not about do no harm. It's about talking about the beneficence is to open up the science space.
Exactly.
That benefits, you know.
If you want to talk about it, you know, there's a really interesting thing about art, because art, by definition, is frivolous. Yeah, it seems to be frivolous. It's non-utilitarian. We can't claim that we are going to do anything besides doing art. Martin Kemp, the art historian from Oxford, said that art has a function but not a utility, and it's really important to distinguish between those things. Now, it's really interesting when it comes to areas of kind of emerging knowledge, for example. where art can come in, and it's often the case where artists are not or perceived to not be allowed to do those specific things because there's no utility. Yeah? So if you scientists and engineers like to talk about their work in terms of we hear, people are dying in hospitals, we're here to save lives, we're here to feed the world, to do all of those kinds of things. So don't stop us from, and we don't have time to discuss the ethics of it, we really need to save people. When an artist does the very same things and engage with the very same issues, there's no place for them to hide. So in a sense, they're distilling, they're bringing out all of the ethical issues that the culture and society needs to come to terms with. So that's the function. But it can only be achieved if there's no utility. So the idea of trying to harness artists, for example, to the concept of innovation, and say, bring artists in order for them to be innovators, in order for someone to profit from it, and patent it and create an IP regime that would benefit from what artists are doing, you're killing art by doing so.
Absolutely.
And in a sense, you're also killing the ethics of those types of engagements.
Yeah. Loren, how does that sit with you?
Well, I think another element of why the benefit thing doesn't quite jive with me is this idea that the artist might know better, or that it's possible to tell people what benefits them that maybe and they don't. I don't really like positioning myself in that way where I'm coming along and I'm helping or shedding light on the things that can only benefit people because I'm fallible and I'm a member of a community and I don't want someone doing that to me as well, and I think that it's done in conversation. And so I think that the idea of benefit to me just reminds me of things like the word progress, which is also a word that I don't really like to use or to align myself with. And so I think that language I'm very fussy about, and so I similarly I think that I have the freedom to not really benefit anyone, fortunately, if I choose. Art in general, or me as a sort of selfish maker.
But as Kelli said, now when you apply for funding, you have to answer those kinds of questions as well. So it's not just for institutional committees, it's for the government, and the way that the bureaucrats talk about it, it's a way for them to be able to explain to the politicians why they should continue supporting art. As if we constantly need to argue the case that art is an important part of society. So people are suffering of this amazing amnesia. Every time, every round, there's this amnesia that we have to remind people that art is important for
Let
society.
them do it.
It's a hard transition as an artist to make as well. Graduating from an arts course and then starting to start my own practice, coming to the situation where a mentor was telling me that art is selfish and it can be, and that's fine. Even from the perspective of it doesn't have to have that why. Through university and through all your schooling as an artist for so long, you're asked, but why do we care? Why is it good for our community? Why are you doing it? Why? The why becomes so much more important than the work that you're creating to respect. It's a hard thing to balance or to adjust yourself to respect. Absolutely.
I think we as artists, we're always asking ourselves questions, whether they're selfish or not, whether they are, whatever they're about. I think it's still, that's one of the things that I think we make art for, because we are constantly questioning who we are and what's the world, and how do I talk about that, and
I think from our perspective and PVI and because we make participatory artworks in public spaces, and so for us, I think we think less and less about our audiences as kind of ticket-paying public, and more about as kind of creative comrades who are kind of coming along with us, experiencing things with us. They're in it, we're in it together, and the idea of participation is actually much more democratic and not forced upon you. And I think for us, that's kind of we're really interested in that, and kind of there are some kind of ethical dilemmas with that as well, and that perhaps some kind of false assumptions that you might start making about where audiences, how far they're willing to go with you in exploring something, or in the recent work that we made, Black Market, people are jumping into garbage bins and pissing in vases and just doing things that we kind of, there's headphones and these instructions to kind of listen to, and there's this kind of permission to misbehave. But and I think the important thing, in a way, when you think about ethics in relation to our practice or performance practice and audiences that are involved is to always give an option, an out, to always give a way out. So there's that kind of, there's always that freedom of choice. Because I think when it's forced upon you, it's kind of, that's when it gets really problematic, I would say. Yeah.
I might just, so that we can start to break down some of these, because I think we're touching on a few different points. One of the things I think we could potentially look at it is, and what we've touched on is what we can say ethical practice. So the ethical choices that you make, whether your practice is going to be sustainable, the research behind, and whether you're going to be going taking blood or whether you're going to be interviewing people. So how you actually go about your practice as an artist, your ethical engagement, who you choose to create for, and how you engage with an audience. Ethical creation, so the themes that you actually choose to explore, the things you want to nibble into or bite into. Are there any other? Is there anything else that we could put aside as a little box that we can open up again tonight?
I'd add in that idea of who is the ethical decision for? Is it for the artist in their creation of the work, or is it for the public or the audience who are participating or receiving that work? And maybe to quickly unpack that, I think that a lot of the things we've been talking about are touching on this, that the reasons say that lawyers, doctors, others might have ethics usually enshrined in laws is really for the protection of the public. It's not to benefit the lawyers to go home and think, that's great, I had an ethical day today, drink my glass of wine. It's really public protection that's in play there. And that's the thing we've been talking about, is that the primary consideration or a key consideration for ethics in arts, or is it more about individual art practice and the processes and so on that go through it, that goes through?
I imagine it swings between the two.
Yeah, and sometimes you want to disturb your audience. Sometimes the ethical thing to do is to piss off your audience.
Yeah.
It's not about making warm and fuzzy. We're not TED Talks here. We're not about
Yeah.
the world is going to be a great place. It's really about shaking people.
Okay. Let's talk about that.
If you think,
ethical engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. But then there's, I think, Kelli mentioned the ethics of funding. Who you are kind of whitewashing by taking their money. As well as like what is the contract that you have when you start to benefit from other people's wrongdoings.
Yeah.
Let's bite into ethical engagement first. Let's go with that one. Kelli, you were just saying a lot of the time you'll put your audiences into a vulnerable situation, but you always are giving them that kind of an out.
Yeah.
Where did that start for PVI? Why did you see a need to go in that direction, or?
I think well, I guess we've been making work in public space for around 18 years, and for us it became really apparent that the politics of public space is kind of highly contested, and I would argue that there is no such thing as public space in this day and age, that it's quasi-public, or it's always owned by somebody, and that there are permits and permissions now above and beyond that you kind of have to plough through that didn't used to be around. The origins of the word public mean belonging to the people. So that doesn't necessarily, I would argue that doesn't happen, but I think for us it was a case of kind of being frustrated by the kind of the white box space and the black box space, and always wanting to open up a window, pick up a phone, engage with the real world, and the idea of if your audience aren't coming to you, you go to the audience. And so in doing that we just kind of found ourselves, I guess, out on the streets and realizing that it's such a dynamic kind of contested, problematic space to be operating in as artists, and that when you bring that extra dimension of audience along with you, it's another layer of kind of complications. And so there are a lot of things that you have to bear in mind, and we often joke now when we make work, like are we going to budget for permits, or are we going to budget for fines? And that it sounds quite funny, but it's actually the truth, and actually quite disturbing when you think about what that means. And so I guess for us, there's a lot of strategy when we talk about kind of tactical intervention. We really do think tactically and strategically about how we're going to maneuver an audience from A to B, how we're going to kind of operate this work on a street-based level, and encourage people to play this pervasive game that is perhaps engaging with kind of difficult subject matter in kind of playful ways. Play is a tactic for us to use to deal with difficult subject matter. When you invite people to play a game, it's for us it's kind of like a thinly veiled kind of experiment, I would say. So But you know, we do things like we have lots of risk analysis. The risk analysis sounds really boring, but it's great because you just basically list out all the possible things that could go wrong, the worst possible things, and how you would mitigate that or what you would put in place. You know, do we need security guards out there? Do we need kind of extra performers? Do we need walkie-talkies so people can talk to each other? How are we going to make sure everyone is safe, our performers safe, our audience is safe? How are we going to do that? And it's like this giant map of kind of like our duty of care. It's a really important thing. So it's not just about the ideas and the, you know, the creative content. There's a whole other world around it that we need to make sure is kind of really robust.
Yeah. And that background work, is there, if that was missing, that risk analysis, if that care wasn't taken, if that responsibility for your audience wasn't taken, do you feel that that's where, I mean, I know we don't want to talk about censoring, but is that where unethical engagement comes in, where we kind of just chuck audiences in and just hope they'll be okay?
I think from our perspective, I think that's deeply problematic, and it's something that we go to great lengths to try to address from the get-go when we decide to make work. It's something that's kind of like a foundational principle. If we're asking people and, you know, generously making this invitation, and I think it has to be generous, and I think it has to come from a place of generosity, but, you know, it has to be, they have to feel as though they're in safe hands. They have to be in safe hands.
What if you want to piss them off?
So there's layers.
You can still do
You
that.
can still do that. You can layer the sense of security as well.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think no one in the right mind wants to kill or harm another person,
No.
even if it's to just make a point. But you want to destabilize them. You want to put them in a place where they're not really sure how things are going to unfold. In many cases, and I think that the best art is the art that challenges you and actually puts you in a position where you lost for words, you lost for you know, you don't know what's coming next. But you have to be smart about it. You know, you can end it up in a bang, and but that might not be the right way of being sustainable about your own practice. And also, there's other ethics. I think that's the responsibility you have towards other people in your field. And in our field in particular, it's when an artist managed to piss off a scientist, for example, to such an extent that the scientist would never work again with an artist. It means that you cut off quite a lot of other people that could have followed through. So it's really important for me, for example, when I get residents to SymbioticA, to be sure that they're not going to be the last resident. And it's not for the audience, it's for the fellow artists. So there's all of those layers that you need to work with. But you know, we work within a culture, within a society, so we need to participate in that. But I think kind of the interesting thing, and I think this is kind of the basic role of art, is that shining the mirror and back into society. And there's different ways to do it. And sometimes people don't like what they see in the mirror. And it's not even your fault. It's because they're ugly. And you want to remind them.
I'm working around some of those ideas currently in a bit of a hilarious way in my current project. So the project that I'm working on now with a collaborator as the duo Pony Express is called Ecosexual Bathhouse, which was brought up earlier. And it's an immersive environment where audience come through and they engage with experiences on a smaller scale, but with a similar intention to some of the, like, you know, roving and interactive things that PVI do. And you know, the theme of the work is that you're entering a space where you become, you're practicing a sexual and romantic relationship with the environment itself and with the earth itself as your lover. And so we're asking audiences, obviously, to be very forthcoming and very, you know, brave and generous in that they're willing to engage with that subject matter in the first place. And then also we have this duty of care, which is tremendous in that we're asking people to be vulnerable and to be, in some cases sexually explicit or engage with explicit material. And we found that almost leaning on the semiotics of the bathhouse is like this perfect map for how to do that, because in that environment there's a huge evolved dialogue of consent and of safety, which all participants engage with as soon as they enter the door. So one of our big challenges has been, establishing consent between humans is something that we have a map for, but establishing it between non-humans and humans, or things that have different sensory and communication systems, is sort of unforetold, and so that's sort of one of our biggest creative challenges. But we've been, lucky enough that if someone doesn't want to do something in the work, or if they're in a bad situation, then they're given a safe word, which is, common practice in that sort of bathhouse scene. And also elements of safety and protection and self-care are woven into the work in a way that's playful and part of the work, so it doesn't feel like you're being you can see the net underneath you, but it does feel like you know where you're at, you know where the other participants are at, and you're really free to play and free to be uninhibited, which is our goal. And so it's kind of was incidental that the work, well, it's not incidental, it's totally on purpose, but it was lucky that there was this pre-existing architecture of communication and consent and safety that we could adapt for our nefarious purposes. So yeah, that was my first time experiencing that in a work, rather than molding what I was doing to some sort of existing institutional ethical framework that I felt wasn't quite custom built for what I was doing. And so I think that's something I kind of want to look for from now on, which is sort of tailoring the way that I approach those things to the themes of what I'm looking at.
There's and of course we're going to find so many moments of grey, but there seems to be a very clear overlap where your practice, if you have ethical practice and you come to it from those points of view, then it will lead to an ethical engagement with your audience in most cases, and by the sounds of it, it sounds like that's how that's working.
Yeah, like and this is again in our field. There's always a perception that if getting artists into labs, something horrible would come out of it. Because artists are by definition untrustworthy. And what I see 20 years in this field working, actually artists to a large extent are way more ethical, responsible, and caring than the other professions that have the same access or more access to those resources. I've been to a conference in San Francisco quite a few years ago, and I was talking about running workshops, teaching artists how to use different types of biological technologies. And the guy next to me was working for the American Defense Force, doing research, black research, that he didn't really want to tell what he's doing. He just said, isn't that cool that we're able to maybe do those kind of things. And he was kind of very elusive in regard to what the application of the work is. But the first question from the audience in the States was to me, and it says, don't you think it's really dangerous to allow artists access to those resources? So it was so easy, I just pointed to the guy next to me and said, this guy gets so much more money, gets a license from the government to actually do stuff which is designed to harm people, and you think that artists are the people that you need to be afraid of? And it was kind of a really shocking moment. And again, this goes back to the question of utility. He's allowed to do it because he figured out ways to kill people, which is quite a utilitarian approach. While an artist seems to be a dangerous person because he doesn't know what he's doing.
But that's a cultural, that comes down to a cultural perception and value, the value of the artist in society.
Can I ask on that, isn't it to some degree, it's the artist's job, and is this where maybe that fear comes from, that it's an artist's job to push the envelope and to push boundaries and to sometimes, in many cases, go right beyond those to cause great change within our history and to make those kind of significant moments. That potentially is where the fear comes from?
Yeah, people don't really like to be taken outside of their comfort zone. And again, I think good artists, the art that takes you outside of your comfort zone.
But they can still do that ethically.
Yeah, and I think most of them are doing it in an extremely ethical way.
Maybe just to shine a light on that ethics law thing again. I would say, so for example, with PBI work, a lot of what goes on there is, you're doing what's legal to do. All the things that are not legal to do and not being done. And so it's...
but what happens when you work in a proto-fascist society like now, here, where there's so many grey zones, and so many discretionary applications of very strange, obscure laws that can be pulled out. All of us are breaking the law in one way or another now, as we see it here. There is a chance, someone with the discretionary power to apply those laws can arrest all of us now, for whatever reason. Is that correct?
Doing a thing.
Possible.
So it is getting more and more problematic, because I think the grey zone of this proto-fascist society we live in is becoming more and more problematic for us to operate in.
Can we talk about that just briefly? Should the arts industry operate? I mean, obviously we're breaking things anyway. This is what we're talking about. Should the arts industry therefore operate by its own code separate to our cultural law, or is that opening a box that is too
That's what's being referred to as the artist alibi, and in America they have it here. So this idea that you actually have an immunity from some things if you call yourself an artist. And quite a lot of the tactical media groups, by definition, chose to refer to themselves as being artists and get all of the artist tropes in order to be able to do activist work. If they would do it in any other context, they would be arrested. So yeah, there is, in Australia we don't have this artist alibi, so we actually are not protected by law. But interesting enough, in America it's still the case. Don't know for how long. But,
Is that something that you think is a positive thing within the industry? Is it, or is that, we'll leave that to America?
No, I think we need it here. I think artists should have not a code of ethics, but a special allowance from society to do things that can be problematic in another context.
And, I think one of the things we can do is take risks that are, with the questions we ask, we don't sometimes know where they're going to go. So, as a scientist, you would have millions of dollars around those questions you're asking with a possible utilitarian outcome. But sometimes we just have no idea. It's an interesting question. The answer might not be quite as interesting.
So if we don't have if we have an artist alibi, who holds an artist accountable if they're just asking questions and exploring? If we don't have that kind of...
So this is where it's getting, there was a case in Melbourne, I can't remember the artist, that was basically just cutting out junk mail that he got, and basically put kids' faces on half-naked bodies and was arrested for pedophilia because the politician didn't want to fund that particular gallery and using his powers in order to be able to complain to the police and do it. Do you remember the name of the artist?
No.
Yes, Paul Yule.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
it.
from,
So-
Lyndall Galleries in Melbourne, and he's with the Healy in Melbourne.
So there's many different forces.
I bought the T-shirt, the protest T-shirt.
Yeah, so the answer is that many forces that might jeopardize or interfere with artistic work. And as artists, we have to figure out ways to navigate that as well.
Can I just mention a bit more how bizarre that case is talking about?
Because I think it's an amazing case.
Yeah, so Sydney Contemporary first art fair in 2014. So Barry Caldulis, he's now the director. He started Sydney Contemporary. Basically, there had been reports in the police. No, he actually wanted to check if it was okay because the case was going with Lyndall Galleries in Melbourne. The New South Wales Police came in and they basically shut the work down, which was an installation we had showing at Sydney Contemporary Art Fair in 2014 at Carriage Works, and they had to put a black cloth around it and have 24-hour security guards and occasional police visitations the whole time during the art fair. So they weren't even allowed to touch or move the work. It's like it automatically became sealed off as a police investigation area, which was quite, I've never seen anything like that. So it wasn't a matter of like...
That was the work with the cutouts?
Yeah, it was sort of a similar. So what he'd done is he's put Justin Bieber's head onto something and then used it like a cut. It was all collage, kind of a collage or something. So and he had like sex toys and things.
So where do we come with that slippery slope? Are there things that are just out of bounds, or do the artists just have free rein to, if they can justify it and give their workings and their clarification, can they go anywhere?
Well, I should mention that recently the courts just said this is, like Henson just said, this is absurd. But because there have been complaints, they have to
follow it
proceed.
through.
So,
I think it's quite healthy when artists have free rein. I think that it promotes a healthy ecology of conversation and, in terms of who holds them accountable. I don't have an answer for that, but I know that communities and, bodies of people are intelligent enough to regulate and to accept what they'll tolerate and what they won't.
But now we're sliding into censorship, which is...
But what I mean is, I don't want that regulation to come from a small insular coven.
No, and we don't operate in a bubble. The whole idea of making artwork is to put it out there. And so I would agree. I don't think any subject matter should be out of bounds. I think that would be, then you kind of sliding into the terrain of kind of, well, what might that be? Self-censorship, in a way.
Right, because the flip side of that is like, there's few things that I would be unwilling to consider or to devote a couple of moments thinking about or discussing with someone, you know, and so I want to have those conversations that I don't necessarily, think are the ones that are most ready to have or easy to have. I want to have ones that are provocative for me, and this is coming from someone who has quite a bizarre outlook on these issues, so
But is that also because an artist can deal with whatever subject matter that is necessary to deal with, whatever they need to explore, but it provided they're, like we were talking about, with ethical practice, or they've got the groundwork, an ethical groundwork that they base their work on, so they can then go forward?
I think that's the responsible approach, but it's not always what's taken. And that is where I consider myself able to pass judgment on a work or on someone's process. If I have engaged with it, if I've engaged with their process in depth, and if I've seen that they haven't taken the consideration to at least create some sort of framework for what they're doing, then I will deem it to be lame and not pay attention to it
But I think
anymore.
it's also important to talk about failure as well, and just what you were talking about, Lyndall, earlier is just that we should be allowed to kind of to explore, to not know what the ending is. And it's the process of getting there and to fail, and that failure then leads to kind of more ideas, or so I think. Yeah, we're not always going to get it right, and that's okay. I think that's actually part of the point.
That's the thing, you have to be prepared to fail, but also if you take risks, you also have to be prepared to pay the price.
Absolutely right.
So, if you want to live your warm, comfortable life, don't become an artist that tries to push the envelope.
Yeah.
If you're willing to push the envelope, also you have to be aware that you're taking a risk there.
Yeah.
And taking a risk means that you might have to pay for it.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, from a legal point of view, what are boundaries?
How does this all feel?
Well, I think this is the point I was trying to make before. If we look at what the law says we can and can't do, there's always that's the sort of thing that the courts are testing, whether that's been breached or not breached. I think that in a way so the ethical decisions become, well, the law doesn't say that we can't do this. We're not stopped from doing this legally. Ethically, should we do it? Is it something we should proceed with and do? Flip side, I think also if the law is saying you can't do this, but we decide that we, as artists, that we can do this, or we want to do this, ethically, should we do that? Should we break the law for a reason that we think is a greater good? And so it's actually a similar decision on either side of the law, but the law, as I guess I'm trying to say at the very beginning, is that boundary that as a society we've picked as the one that is the right or wrong. We might not always agree with that, but that's what the law is designed to do. This is right, that's wrong, we decide that boundary. So the ethical decision, I think, is about crossing that legal boundary, moving into something that is not yet wrong to do, but maybe we don't do it for other reasons. And equally, if we decide to push the law, push the boundary, is there a reason why we wouldn't do that? And so I think in terms of engagement, I mean, it affects these different levels. It's affecting the engagement of the audience and also the decisions you're making as you're putting the work together.
When it comes with things which are emerging, like emerging knowledge or emerging politics, artists are always there in the forefront. Yeah. And in a sense, I end up giving quite a lot of talks to lawyers because they realize that speaking to an artist might give an indication to what the future laws might look like, where the things might be pushed towards. So it's kind of an interesting symbiotic relationship in the sense of someone needs to be pushed, like the penguins. Someone needs to be pushed down to see if the seal is down there, and then the others can jump in or not. So we're willing. I'm willing to be the penguin. Yes.
I'll be the penguin.
Yeah.
And in that, the audience is invited into that risk-taking. And so again, that is a way of, spreading the word is not really what I want to say, but it's a way of gauging where our community sits with that idea. Had they thought about it? What do they think about it? Does it change the way they think? There's all sorts of things that come out of that.
And be ready as an artist to receive your audience as well. Is it lame? Or is it, or is it lame and then you walk away and have to come back? So it might seem lame, but is it?
Totally. The sleeper.
If you have no tools to analyze it, it initially would look lame, and then you can put things in.
Can we touch on audience? And I want to get to funding, and then I also want to get open to questions as well. So we're going to try and race through this. As an audience or as a public, do we have an ethical responsibility to our artists?
Yeah, we have to pay them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Is that where it ends? Otherwise then they have, we as an artist just have to be open to their responses. Pay us appropriately.
Pay us
as we
through
ask.
an understanding that actually society is more than just the individuals who make it, that there is a role, and this is something which is disappearing more and more. It's the same like education as well. That, you know, the idea that students have to pay for the education because it's only for their individual benefit is an extremely problematic issue. And it's the same with art. I think the way I talk about it is society is being measured by what they're spending the money in regard to their frivolous activities. Yeah? So when you think about the new stadium, for example, this is one way to keep the audience happy and stupid. And if the government would be actually concerned about the well-being of the society, it would invest more in actually allowing artists to do things that would challenge our society intellectually and make us more prepared, in a sense, if you want to talk about some kind of utility to what's coming next. If we're just going to sink into kind of those men running after balls type of activity as if this is really the top of our intellectual achievement as a society, we're not going anywhere with that. So in a sense, we have to, and it's to some sense, our role as well to convince people that actually it is an important benefit to society to allow artists to experiment and push us to places.
I would say the responsibility is to engage with art and to be voracious in terms of how in-depth and how frequently you do choose to engage. I think that we live in a culture where a lot of marketing takes on the aesthetics of art and tries to pass itself off as art and does so extremely successfully, and so it's quite easy as a consumer to be lulled into a place where you feel like you're participating in art or taking on art, but you've actually been marketed to, and it's sort of it's you who are becoming the product in many cases, and so it's not always easy. And sometimes you have to go to weird geographical places, and sometimes you have to pay money. But I think that it is an ethical responsibility because it keeps everything moving, and it keeps the ecosystem sort of flourishing when ideas are engaged with in that way. And it also it makes you a part of the conversation, which makes the conversation healthier.
Just the example.
Go for it.
I think of that definitely along the lines of payment or response to the artwork. And I was just going to mention the example of Amanda Palmer, the former musician, who uses the example of her career starting when she was a street performer, sort of standing, I think, dressed as an angel and on a street corner, and made a lot of money out of doing that, or enough money to survive through never actually asking anybody to engage with her. But it was the basis on which she then took other steps in her career to understanding that there was a willingness on an audience's part to pay for something that they enjoyed. And so I would probably argue there's not necessarily an ethical issue there about should an audience be required to respond to art, but it actually is it's the reaction of people that counts. And if that leads to then an understanding that there's a need to pay an artist to allow them to continue, that's the point, to educate people about that. I wouldn't necessarily argue that it's an ethical thing. It's not necessarily ethically wrong to enjoy Amanda Palmer's work for half an hour and walk off.
Yeah.
She's in a bit of an ethical quagmire herself, isn't she, for not paying the musicians that she conscripts around the world when she tours. Just putting that out there.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily default to her as the appropriate.
That's another big one. That's but look, while we're talking about paying, and let's jump into funding a little bit as well. So recently, Kelli began a online platform or online resource, or began to try and build one, called the Ethical Arts Resource, which looks at funding and what our ethical engagement with funding bodies is. So I will just read from here a quick background into it. So in Australia, both sides of politics are in the process of manoeuvring the arts into the arms of the business sector through cuts to funding and setting up policies and mechanisms to foster future sponsorship relationships between the arts and business. The potential impact of this strategy could see artists and artworks severely compromising their core ethics in an effort to remain financially viable. Kelli, I'll let you start on this one
Yeah,
first?
look, this is so problematic, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to raise it. Really, is though this came about I'll backtrack. So, as people are familiar with the Biennale, Sydney Biennale, 2014, the boycott that happened, and the resulting furor that it came about from the government, and in particular Senator Brandish, who was the arts minister at the time, his response to the boycott and the government calls of kind of vicious ingratitude of the artists to boycott the festival because of the fact that the chair at the time was involved in that $300 million deal that was providing kind of garrison services to the offshore detention centres in Manus Island and Nauru. And so as a result of that, I mean, everyone knows the story, like he resigned, Transfield have now changed their name, but what also happened was that Senator Brandish then decided to place an extreme amount of pressure on the Australia Council to develop a policy around sponsorship in the arts that would, in effect, punish artists for refusing to accept sponsorship monies on ethical grounds. And the result of this pressure is still unknown. I think since then the whole $105 million heist happened, which has destabilised the entire kind of artistic ecosystem in Australia, I think. So what happened as a result of that was, well, a lot of artists kind of got together, and it kind of came from this idea of, it's not just government that can write policy and have strategic plans, and we have to do it all the time as artists, and maybe there is a framework that we could develop that we could all contribute to that considers our ethical positions, or maybe there is a template document that we can tweak individually that we can then place into our business plans or our strategic plans, or we can put up online, or we can send them to other arts organisations that encourage them to think about their ethical positioning. Mm-hmm. And so I spoke to a group in London called Platform, who are amazing. They're kind of like an artist activist research space, and they were very involved with the Liberate Tape campaign, which actually in the last few weeks has had some success. That they have now dropped their BP is not sponsoring tape now, which came, I would say, as a result of the huge amount of artistic campaigning and activism that came about with the Liberate Tape campaign. Anyway, so we spoke to them. They kind of gave us some ideas around positioning statements. There was a very small group of artists in Perth, there were some artists in Sydney, and it was kind of a little bit all over the place. We then spoke to NAVA, who are the kind of the peak body for visual arts in Australia, and are an advocacy organisation for visual arts and culture. And so we slowly started to develop this kind of template document that perhaps could go up online. We thought it could go up online. And people could contribute to. And that was in January last year, I think. And then, in a way, I think what happened was it became so complicated to try to put on paper what you would consider to be, and I brought a load of copies so that people can have a look and have a think. Because at the moment, it's just sitting on my desktop. And I really don't know what the right thing to do is, but there's kind of, we engaged a lawyer. Michael very kindly came in to help us kind of look at the legal standpoint out of it. And it talks about like a code of ethics template and what we as artists, would consider supporting. I can hand these out if people wanted to have a look, or should I do that?
Well, we might. What I might do is we might leave them towards the end, and then if people
have a
want
look
to
and
pick
see
them
what
up
you
as
think,
we
because
go.
it just became so problematic, and in a way we tried to kind of, what I think needs to happen is actually it needs to be more open source and a wiki-based platform where you can just go to and explore, various options, and people can kind of contribute to research or other examples. But it's not uncommon, and I will refer back to the UK and Platform, because they put us in touch with other arts organisations who have actually got their own ethical guidelines on sponsorship, and they very clearly make a statement about, sponsorship companies that they would be willing to go to and ones that they would not consider. And in a way it kind of makes it sound like this real luxury, like we've all got these, we do not have like organisations knocking down our door going, can we sponsor your art event? So I think in a way for me it was just a case of I can kind of see where the scenario is heading, of kind of being pushed more and more into the realm of seeking corporate sponsorship. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us as practitioners who, like we're talking about, are priding ourselves of kind of with this kind of notion of occupying the unknown, of taking risks. Where do we draw the line in terms of like our own financial culpability of kind of seeking sponsorship, if that's where we're pushed towards. So in a way it was trying to kind of preempt that and kind of come up with some thinking, and I think maybe we jumped to the end instead of exploring the middle ground a bit. That's
So
kind of a bit of background.
Yeah. How do you guys feel about that?
Actually, I have a very long letter sitting on my desk. Because it's kind of interesting. Obviously, it started with this idea that artists might object to the ethical conduct of companies that would sponsor them.
Yes.
But it also comes, and in our field, it's extremely important. So the policy of SymbioticA is not to get funding from anything that we perceive to be a pressure group. So either biotechnological companies that want us to somehow promote what they're doing, or we actually rejected funding from the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. Because we don't want to be seen as if we are taking one point of view. The idea of art, especially in this field, being ambiguous, being independent, being autonomous, or at least have a perception of being autonomous, is extremely important, because otherwise we would lose trust. And I see it, many of the artists internationally that are being funded to do similar work to what we're doing are actually being funded by other government agencies that are there to promote biotechnology, or pharmaceutical companies, or companies that are there to try and promote a very specific, we talk about it in terms of who's got the right to capture the public imagination and who's got the purse to take over that. So we had an experience with a big foundation that commissioned us to do work. And when they didn't like the work, because it was a critical piece of work, they sent us a letter, and that's a lesson to all artists there. If you want to be rejected, try and piss them off so much that they're actually honest. So the rejection letter became an amazing document, because we managed to annoy them so much that they lost their filters, and they ended up saying that our work didn't represent the public opinion in regard to this specific thing that we were commissioned to deal with, which no funder in the right mind would actually say. They would think it, but they would never put it in writing. And in this case, they were so annoyed with us that they actually put it in writing and said that as artists we didn't represent what they thought the public opinion is ought to be.
So what was that particular piece of work that you're talking about?
So it was quite an old one. It was back in the year 2000, some of you might not remember, but there was an event that was supposed to celebrate the so-called completion of the first draft of the Human Genome Project. So the Human Genome Project was a project started in the 1990s to try and map our genome, and around 1998, a private company, that was a big public effort, and then in 1998 a private company came in and started to do it way faster than the public, and there was basically they ended up admitting that they set up this fictitious date, or this date in June 2000, to declare the Human Genome Project complete in order to get the media off their back, because there was all of those conversations around who's got the right for the human genome, if it's a private company or the public, and they decided to stop it by declaring something which wasn't finished. And our work was looking at the rhetoric that was used in order to promote this so-called fictitious event. And we came up with a project called the Pig Wings Project, where we said, okay, you promised that now the impossible is possible, so we would grow wing-shaped objects out of pig tissue, and by that, see also what shape those flying pigs would have, or the wings. So we looked at the three evolutionary solution of flight invertebrates, which are the birds, the bats, and the pterodactyls. And we looked at the iconography of those wings, so we know that bird wings are usually attached to angels, bat wings are usually attached to demons and devils, and the pterodactyl wings, beside the reference to Jurassic Park, are not really attached to anything, because we found out about them late in our history. So there were three different versions in which we can look at this new discovery, if you like. And they didn't like it, because they felt that it was a direct critique of the kind of the hyperbole rhetoric that they were using. And the response actually served that very same purpose. So we ended up actually using the letter, the exchange, as part of the piece when we presented it, to such an extent that when they realized it, they threatened to sue us for breach of copyright and for defamation. Although, this is kind of interesting thing with the libel laws in the UK, that even if everything we said was true, if they can prove that we've done it in order for them to look bad, that's defamation, and we're liable. And because we're part of the university, they didn't contact us directly, they contact UWA's legal office, and we had to deal with them. And we decided to remove that thing from our website, but we were cheeky and we put, due to legal threats from that foundation, we had to remove that from our site, and we might move it to a non-university site. Then they got so pissed off with us that they actually threatened to remove, because it's usually, the foundation usually supports scientific research. The arts and science part was a very small part of it. And there were about 3 or 4 projects in UWA funded by this foundation, and they threatened to pull the funding from the scientists as well.
Yeah.
And then we decided, okay, we'll back off. But we published it in quite a few papers, and whenever I go to the UK, where this foundation is, I make a point to tell the story, to such an extent that now they're actually interested in buying the piece. And we put such a ridiculous amount of money that we'll see if they will come. But there's a good chance it will end up in the collection, which is another funny.
I feel like we're starting to get a little bit itchy and wanting to ask some questions. So if we don't get any questions, we'll keep discussing this. So by all means, ask us some questions about funding. But is there anything from tonight that anybody wants to throw something to the panel about so far? It always starts off shy. And there's one, and then throw it. No. Cool. You all want me to help? We'll keep. Oh yeah.
I just wanted to. My personal view is that I think one of the biggest problems in Australia at the moment, ethically, in terms of artists' personal ethics, is to do with cultural appropriation. I think it's a really big elephant in the room, and it's. I think the real problem is that, because like you mentioned, I mean, it's kind of very similar to the Paul Yor case, whereas in that someone complained some sort of harm was perceived at children or whatever, but only according to certain groups, and that wasn't done consciously by the artist. I think there's a really big problem in Australia where there's a lot of cultural appropriation happening with Indigenous art and also art from other Indigenous cultures all over the world that may not necessarily be done consciously by the artist, and they're not aware of the amount of harm that that's causing. So I can even give you one example would be when a couple of very famous, it's mainly in the visual arts sector, a couple of very famous painters were basically doing cultural appropriation, but they thought it was okay, or they didn't realise they were doing it, but they didn't really care, without understanding that there were a huge number of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists in Australia that were very offended and really upset that they didn't care and that they were causing a lot of harm. And I guess it also carries on into, we're dealing with other law, we're dealing with spiritual law, Indigenous law. I mean, I guess we'd also, in the case of, Islamic law, all that kind of stuff, religious law, blasphemy. So I think there's a real problem with that is a minefield, that is an ethical minefield, and it's also all over the world. It's got to the point now, and I think it also ties in with the funding thing as well, with sponsorship, because it's becoming really problematic now, because I feel that the events like the Biennale, they're almost become entertainment events, family entertainment events that are sponsored by corporations. And the artists are mere entertainers. We have a joke in Sydney where we talk about us. We're like the court jesters, and they'll even do this now. They'll bring in young emerging artists to do, for opening events, unethically pay them, $5 or whatever, or it's good for your career, and it's all about promoting and sponsorship and corporate sponsorship and entertainment events rather than. And people are questioning, where is the art here? I can't see the art. And so, and I think all tied into that is this problematization of fashion and art and cultural appropriation. So there was an event at the NGV a couple of years ago where this sort of fashion art label were actually basically ripping off traditional Australian Indigenous and African Indigenous cultural artefacts and designs, and everyone thought it was cool, but there was a whole lot of people that thought it was not cool. So I'm just wondering.
That's a huge.
That's a can of worms. Sorry.
No,
But to me, it's a bit of an elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I really appreciate
And especially what you're talking about, that having that sort of ethical framework, not just for sponsorship, but I mean, I follow a blog by an artist called Nat Thomas in Melbourne, and she just recently wrote about the NGV fashion show, and there's not one Indigenous artist represented, for example. So there's a lot of really unethical things going on within curation and
Totally.
institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's even beyond. I mean, sponsorship's tied in, but
Yeah.
it's a bigger field that I think is
Yeah.
not being addressed.
We'll give the panel a
Yeah,
chance to respond.
I mean,
No, I
I'm
mean, I
wondering what you think
agree,
about
and I
that.
think that's why, in a way, this idea of having an online resource, maybe it's more of a knowledge base or something that is a go-to place, because we don't have it, we aren't thinking about it, and we should be. But, I mean, a decade ago or so ago, visual arts prizes were, sponsored by tobacco companies, and that was, then it was considered socially unacceptable, and now it's, now it's fossil fuels, but I really hear you. I think it's really, where do you start with that?
I think that you start from teaching people that it's their responsibility to seek out collaborators, and if they're a curator, seek out artists that are racially diverse, gender diverse.
Teaching people where, how?
But yeah, or just make sure they know it's important, right? Like you can figure out how if you give a shit. And a lot of people get a free pass on having a lack of diversity across the map in Australia, and they say that it's because well, this is my network, or this is who I have access to, and it's because you've all come up in a certain economic strata where it's easy to be found and easy to be seen and easy to take the time. And so I really think that it's everyone's responsibility to do that work for themselves and to make a point of representing diversity every chance that they get. And that's
when
across
curating,
but also when working, when collaborating.
But the flip side of that, then you have like the token person, and how you deal with that. It's an extremely
I think the danger of that is really overstated, though, especially like in terms of the culture we're operating in. If you're collaborating with people, like I would worry less about tokenism if you're having an actual collaborative dialogue.
I'm reviewing an application at the moment, and it's something very similar to what Oron, when she came here to do, was trying to deal with, and that's the idea of trying to get, and in their minds is the idea that getting skin of people of different skin color and culturing it and growing it outside of the body is an art thing, and show the fact that they can merge or whatever. But that require taking a biopsy from a person and inflicting an injury of the person, and then you have a white affluent artist wanting to inflict an injury on people of other skin colors as a way of talking about harmony. And it became an extremely such a problematic issue that we're able to twist it because we're able to order cells from a tissue bank in America that actually have racial designation to the skin color of the person that donated the skin, which is extremely problematic in scientific terms as well. But the person I just got the application the other day, it's a similar thing. It's taking people that are coming from different conflict areas around the world and trying to merge their skin to grow together. And my question for her was, have you considered, how are you going to obtain it? What is considered to be an ethical way of injuring a person for your benefit as a white artist, to tell the story for you to feel good about it? And it's an extremely charged area. And where's the balance? And who's going to benefit from it is really an important question.
You see, the problem is that, people, what often comes up is that everyone appropriates we all appropriate. But what I kept asking is like, why do you want to piss people off? Why do you want to piss Indigenous people off again?
But do you think they're doing it, and this is what you were saying before, they're not necessarily doing it, in a lot of cases they're not doing it consciously. And maybe this is, Loren, what you're talking about, is that take the time to consider that.
Yeah, I think also that's one of the silences that I've been talking about. It's a conversation that was shut down a decade ago, and there's very little real conversation about these issues now. And it might be that there's very little writing that's quite critical in this country. There's review, but there's very little.
But it's also, there's this thing, they just think, oh no, it doesn't matter, it's okay.
Well, those are exactly the type of areas that are being shut down in universities as well. It's kind of critical thinking.
Yeah.
This idea, post-colonialist thought is an extremely important one, and we won't get ourselves out of this mess if we're not acknowledging it. But those places are disappearing now.
And those conversations aren't happening.
Exactly.
Did you want to add to
Yeah,
it?
it's on the same kind of thing. Like I come from a research and an art background, like separately. And at what point do we say yes, it has to be appropriate? Yes, you need to think about these things. But at what point does that stop the free flowing of the art? Just thinking about these things and making sure you're ticking those boxes and making sure you're being appropriate and making sure that, like, at what point does that actually impede on the art itself? Like, why can't an artist just be an artist and do what?
But
they
maybe
create
then,
practice?
maybe you don't need to be appropriate when you're having that
Well, that's it, like, at
conversation.
what
Maybe
point?
you're actually being quite antagonistic in order to start the
Yeah.
conversation.
But that should come out of
You know,
awareness. If people doing it out of ignorance, that's the problem. If you choose to be transgressive, if you choose to piss people off, it's different than if you do it out of stupidity or ignorance.
But does that say that it's not actually the art's ethics itself, it's the person's personal ethics and social ethics and all those kind of ethics in itself? So can you separate them?
It's the whole system, because if art schools don't teach their students about those issues, if art schools are not dealing with those issues, if cultural studies doesn't exist in universities anymore, if we as a society decide to hide those questions, that's when it's wrong.
And people are free to make that art, but it doesn't mean that it's good, and it doesn't mean that it should be institutionally validated by those institutions which are publicly, have a mandate to uphold a really high standard.
That comes back to funding again.
Yeah,
If it
absolutely.
sells, people will put it on.
Which is
So
why the
that's a-
fashion
that's-
comes into the issue.
That's
So
an ethical issue, or that's a whole other can of worms to open.
And can I also play devil's advocate here? There's that it's said so often. There's never an original idea. So often our music industry has borrowed so much from African music, and so much of it has been built on another culture, and we have incredible work because we borrowed or stole or collaborated.
There's a big acknowledgement.
I think it can be
This
done
is
in a
not
cooperative
that's not
manner. So, for example, Richard Bell, I'm not going to mention anything about the artist himself, but Richard Bell basically said, all you got to do is check in and say, excuse me, send me a Facebook message. I want to work with these people. I want to make this work. I want to see if it's okay. And then you'll usually find they're more than happy, unless it's something like Wandjina, which is no one touches Wandjina, because that's like super sacred. Like not even Indigenous people touch Wandjina. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to be doing a performance on a very sacred site in North America when I leave SymbioticA. Now, I could just easily walk onto that sacred site, set up my cameras, have my assistant working with me, storm in and walk out. But I'm actually trespassing, first of all. But secondly, I checked in. So I found out, okay, what country is this? Who are the caretakers? Who looks after this site? And I actually emailed the guy and he said, sure, come along. We're doing this thing, come and do your performance, that's fine. But it's more to do with people, they don't check in, they're not like this one particular artist was making something about Arnhem Land. All he had to do was put the feelers out, can I go and get permission, or maybe even go up there and talk to people, and I'm sure it would have been okay, because he was trying to have this dialogue with himself, with the people of Arnhem Land, but they weren't invited to the conversation. So it's about inviting people into the conversation, I think, rather than...
And taking responsibility.
Yeah, until it's okay, I got asked recently by another artist to go and document some work that she wanted to make on Wandjina country, and she's like a older artist from ACT, and I rang my contact who used to work at Des Art, I'm not naming anyone, and I said, this isn't cool, is it? And they went, no way. And I said, okay, I'm not going to take that job. Even though I would have got paid, because it's
What if the answer is no? What if as an artist so for example that artist, that she, for her work and for the process and the progress and for what she needed to say, she needed to go there, she needed to go to that place. And if she did approach him and said no...
I just said to her to withdraw my name from the funding application.
But as an artist, if you seek that permission,
Well, I think
and then
it
you
comes
don't
back
get
to
it.
what
Is
you were
that
saying earlier about your line of ethics
Yeah.
and whether
Yeah, it is a
using the-
personal ethical
Yeah.
thing. Like for her, it wasn't a problem,
Mhm.
but I checked. For me, it was because I was a bit unsure, and so
Yeah,
I.
but then she should be willing to take the flak for it.
Right.
Yeah, well, I
If
just
she
I don't.
would then
I,
be
it's not up to
also
me
righteous
what
about it,
I'm not
that's-
responsible
yeah,
for what
exactly,
she
yeah.
does.
Yeah.
So she's
No,
probably
we're talking
gone
about her
ahead.
now, not about you. In
Yeah.
sense of the
Yeah,
fact that
that's up to her.
Yeah.
You know, I can't. But I didn't want to be associated with that. You know, so I was actually turning down a few $1,000s as a struggling artist. But for me, my ethical consideration was.
You should
front
contribute
row.
it to the ethical arts resource.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think some case studies would be.
That would be
interesting.
great.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Is
like
it-
just
Rhea, yes.
So on Jess's point about how much of our own culture or different art is built from taking things from other art, where do you think then is the line for cultural appropriation? When does it then become not?
When someone says, you're hurting me, like you're hurting me by taking from my culture, I think that's a pretty clear line. There's another good way of thinking it, which is that it's usually a stronger position to be punching up rather than punching down. So maybe consider shitting on the people who are on top of you instead of the people who are below you in terms of historical power structures. Those are my personal ethical lines with that. Yeah.
I think also for me, I'd add, if I'm not sure, I don't do it.
Yeah, I think it's not as like mysterious as some people would argue. It's quite hard and fast, really.
Can I ask you, and I know I'm playing devil's advocate,
Yeah.
and for the purpose of this, I need to be devil's advocate as much as I hate it. Let's look at the fashion industry, right? There was in terms of cultural appropriation, there was a period where every music festival, there were women and young people wearing chieftain feathers. I actually don't know what they're called, so there's my
War bonnet.
headdress.
Pardon?
War bonnet.
War bonnet. So they were wearing to music festivals, and traditionally, as I understand it, it's not something that anybody other than the chief of a culture will wear. And then from there were some people watching that debate happen online. There were some people that said, no, it shouldn't happen at all. Some people that were saying, not even to the level that feathers should not be worn on your head because that's a cultural appropriation. Whereas in some of the debate, there were people from within the culture who were saying, feathers are okay, but the war bonnet isn't. And so when we say, if somebody says you're hurting me from a culture, which person do you choose to listen to?
Yeah.
I suppose is the question.
I guess I would listen. That's a good way of putting it. And I would say, even I think where this gets particularly the forefront of this conversation, I think is happening around food right now, because everyone's super who among us does not love poaching delicious foods from other cultures and ones that are colonially, traditionally at a disadvantage, and that's kind of, people are starting to sort of stir the pot around that metaphorically. But I would say, with the war bonnet issue, I think it was such a unilateral disgust from the community that was being taken from. And I think that, the response that I think is appropriate, and this is, I'm part of a group that puts on a music festival, and we have don't do that here policy, and you're free to do it, but I'm also free to think that you're a dickhead for doing it. And
as well, it comes back to Oren's point about operating from a place of ignorance. It's like, do your research. It's not that hard to find out, and so. And then you can make a choice. Do your research, find out as much as you can, and then the decision making shouldn't be that hard, I don't think. Really?
Because I think ultimately, even if it's, not necessarily, I don't think any person, unless they nominate themselves, should be held as the representative of their culture unless they're willing to be. And so when you say, what person do you listen to, I'm willing to listen to anybody from a culture who tells me what to do, especially when it comes to fashion, because that's something that I'm so free to evolve and adapt, and I have nothing at stake. Whereas if you feel like your history or your cultural identity is at stake and you're just some guy, then that means a lot to me. You don't have to be, an elder or someone who has prominence in the community. I just empathize with you anyways. That's
I was going to say, on that topic at the moment as well, there is the problem of, I'm sure everyone's seen the video that's been passed around on social media about dreadlocks and braids and cornrows, and that's become another issue as well. Like all the stars, anybody that does get dreadlocks or anyone that gets those kind of cultural kind of hair designs at the moment are being slammed for being culturally inappropriate. It's like, is that another thing that we say, you know, that's not okay, dreadlocks are not okay if you are Caucasian? Like,
is part of this conversation about you? Before, Loren, you talked about collaboration. If you're there and you're making an invitation to the culture and you're joining a conversation with the culture that you're trying to appropriate from or borrow from, so it becomes some kind of a collaboration. So you're there doing it for, you know, the purpose of the conversation, rather than you're there doing it because you think it, you know, it's going to look cool
like,
to
black
somebody
people
without.
going into R&B and going into rap and things like that, you can argue that it's not part of it's culturally inappropriate for someone with Caucasian skin to go in and practice like something that was originally with African Americans in America, for example.
I guess if you want to stake, you know, your legitimacy, the way society interprets you as an ethical creature, and you know, your relationship with a very vocal group of people who are claiming that their well-being is at stake on your hairstyle, then that's your call. You know, there's no one who's going to tell you to stop. But I think that, you know, these conversations rise to the surface for a reason, and you can choose to listen to them if you want to, in whatever level of detail and nuance you want to. And you know, I think we're all participating in them, and so people are really into like marveling at the fact that this is even happening at the moment, which I think is not the most interesting thing. I think it's interesting to actually engage the conversation rather than just be flummoxed that, like, you know, people are actually speaking up about things that they don't like to see happening and spreading around in the world. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of where I'm at.
I was going to say, just to pick up that point about, I think that, you know, ethics does come down to the choice that you've got to make. That's really where it becomes an ethical question. And I think you can make the argument that if you're not aware of the problem, is there actually an ethical issue? It's more a case there, I think, of awareness and education and so on. And I think you're right, Kelly, that in some cases, just claiming an ignorance of something isn't enough. If you could find out, you know, obviously from a legal point of view, you can never say that I don't know what the law was. Come off the hook. So I think there's interesting questions around that in terms of whether you know, dreadlocks have been worn for a long time. Now that people are aware of these issues, that changes the nature of that decision quite a bit.
I think the dreadlock thing's a bit grey anyway, because any serious Jamaican Rasta would say if you're not practicing Rastafarian and you got dreads, they'll just go, "Oh, you're a fashion dread. We don't really care." So exactly. I think it's, what I was talking about was more about like actual very sacred cultural symbols. You know, like visual forms that are then put onto garments and then sold.
It's all part of the wider conversation of it. And I think that's that thing of operating from a space of awareness. And then when you're not aware, when you become aware, acting
and the music
responsibly.
thing's very tricky.
That's right.
We might open it up to something further, because as we can do a whole conversation on cultural appropriation.
Yeah, but I think we should invite some other people on the panel.
Yeah. Can I? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, would you think that all artists should always see themselves as part of their own audience, so they have to be aware of how their audience is reacting to their work and adjust their accordingly?
Yeah. Can I use an example of Proximity Festival? Because this is when we set up that festival, which Loren has been in, which is a one-on-one festival. So it's like one artist, one audience member, 10 to 15 minute encounter in a different space every year, and 12 artists doing those performance experiences, and they can be incredibly intense. Experiences, and one thing that we always, when we work with the artists every year, and they're assigned mentors, it's always about positioning yourself as the audience member, because you cannot expect the number of times that you hear a lot of assumptions from artists saying, well, I'm just going to ask them questions about their personal life, and then we're going to do this, and then when it's like, hang on a minute, put yourself in their position. and ask those questions and see how comfortable you are with that. And, you know, so you've always got to place yourself as that audience member, I would say, first and foremost, because if you do that, then it's going to be so much easier to operate, you know, from the other side of it as well. So, I think definitely from that perspective, from a performance perspective.
Yeah, so visual artists not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I have to make work that I believe in.
Yeah.
And, you know, you don't know who the audience is going to be. You know, they're not someone who talks to you.
That's right.
And you set it out there and then
it's out there and you see what happens. And, and if I constantly tried to please an audience, I'd be crazy.
No, this isn't about pleasing.
But you know, there's no
I don't
other
think
way
it's to do with that, because I think that a lot of performance work, and in particular proximity, it is about they can be quite destabilizing. They can be, you know, quite difficult encounters. It isn't about making that audience member happy. It's about understanding what the impact of what you're doing is having on that audience member, and knowing what that is then informs your idea.
It is, but the difference is that I leave a work in a space.
Yeah.
For 5 weeks.
Yes, huge difference. Yeah.
And, you know, so all I get is that's lovely.
Yeah.
So do you feel like you have a duty of care for your audience at all, Lyndall? Or do you feel like it's just, you just put it out there and it's their responsibility how much they choose to engage?
That's a really hard question to answer. Because I try and make work that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly so. And this is kind of an interesting thing. So you don't really want your audience to say, we really enjoyed it and how lovely it was. Because, this is the worst compliment you can get.
But by the same token, I can't make work for an audience that I don't know who's going to be in that space at any given time. You know? So it's different, very different.
If I can, there's all sorts of schools of thought, but I think within the visual arts in particular, and especially when it's process-based art, you tell the stories to yourself. And if anyone wants to listen, it's their problem. So you don't even think about the audience in this context. You think about, I found something that I find either disturbing or uncomfortable. I want to investigate further. And the way I investigate as an artist is by visual means. I'm trying to find a new language to engage with those things that I have no words to describe. And I take it out there because I found this journey, this story compelling for me, and maybe some other people would kind of join me on this journey. But if you start to think at the very beginning about what someone else, this undefined, Joe Smith, would think about the journey that you're taking at the moment, you'll never get anywhere.
Or will it sell?
They're very different disciplines, and they're coming from very different places.
I reject that entirely, Kelli. I completely reject that.
Well, they're different disciplines.
Yeah, of course.
No.
Well, listen.
I'm
in a very anti-disciplinary place in my practice right now, and I've come from like this sort of conceptual visual background, and now I'm working with audiences a lot, and like I don't really know. I'm just adapting and kind of plagiarizing and moving as I go. And I think that like I agree. Like my first instinct when you said that was to be like, but who even like cares about the audience? And like, what if I don't even want an audience? And then when I was listening to you, I was like, all those times when I took such good care of my audience was so good. And then listening to you, I was thinking like, don't you feel like you want to like, it's in some way be responsible for what happens before and after, or like give them that seduction and aftercare that, you're doing anyway through things like the way you market yourself or the way you write about your work or whatever. Like that is a type of care and framing that gives people exactly what Kelly's describing, which is the tools they need to engage with your work before and after. And so I think that it is much blurrier, and I'm kind of like, wading through the weeds of it at the moment with navigating the way that I'm sort of confronting my practice. And I think that there's a lot they're totally adaptable.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. I feel I have a few video works, and I've seen an audience engage with them. They spend about 3 seconds in front of the work.
Yeah.
You spend years to do, and they're just walking by, and they pick up. I've been to a Swedish exhibition where the audience picked up like one frame and made a whole story out of it. And I asked the curator what they were talking about. It was nothing to do with what my work was about. But that's what they took out of it. And so you also have to be aware that you're doing the work, and it could be read either deliberately or just by haphazard or out of indifference or ignorance or whatever, in many, many different ways which you never intended to do, and that's part of it. You can't be overly possessive over that as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
And we write these artist statements, and they can be misinterpreted. The last one I wrote for Stations of the Cross started a conversation about, some diocese wanted to use it as a talking point, devoid from the work.
So just
It's very human.
Just the statement. And I said, fine, as long as the work goes with it.
Yeah.
It's a didactic panel for the work rather than
Yeah.
So we probably, did we have another question here? Yes? Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, it seems as though with ethics, is that on the one hand that moralism versus embodied or like law, so I suppose like law versus like a sense of moral. There's also like ethics that's kind of like more like an aesthetics or like a style of living, like so not something about moralisms, but like just like kind of these little kind of small principles we have that kind of guide us. It might not be about a big principle, but those kind of little intuitions or whatever. And I was thinking about that in terms of because I think there's been loads of quite interesting comments about how there isn't like a free artist that should be allowed to do anything anymore, but there is art that should be allowed to do it. You can, and I really like that idea of pushing the art, but the artist having a sense of responsibility and duty care. And I suppose it was kind of picking up you just going actually about that word indifference, and I thought a lot of the talk about what art should do has been quite bound to this idea of disruption and kind of almost like trauma or this idea that you should affect something kind of quite big in an audience. And I was thinking about these other modes of like indifference or kind of like fleeting kind of stilling or just like a sense of like calm or whatever you can get from art. And how all those things are really quite powerful and affirmative in different modes too. And I suppose of like the ethics of trying to do that. And I suppose and as well about, isn't there a problem of defining the ethical impact of art or the ethical intervention of art in terms of those kind of disruptive tendencies and not about these kind of less disruptive ones. And I suppose about how do you then get to the stage where you've got a better evaluative schema in which to kind of understand the impact of art or its kind of intervention.
I love this question. Yeah, I think that the way that you've framed that is really wonderful. And I don't necessarily have an answer, but I would say that like with my practice, I would like to get to a place where like I don't rely on confrontation in order to create change. And I think that a lot of art that I would perhaps be dubious of kind of wields this hammer force when something more subtle or more suitable or more seductive, in the terms that I'm currently interested in, would do, and where you can sort of inseminate people with ideas in a way that is from mutual participation instead of from creating a power dynamic where you're deigning to give them an experience that they couldn't otherwise, have the wherewithal to seek out themselves. So I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at in negotiating that.
Yeah, I think that I'm always reminded of, and I can't remember who said it, but the more overtly political a work is, the less impact it has. And I think that that's kind of really, really true. That if you just kind of you're just pushing and pushing and pushing instead of kind of just very subtly inviting people in and yeah, I agree with you. I think there are very different ways. It doesn't have to be, completely confrontational at all. I think that there's space for that, but there's also, space for a lot of other subtle approaches as well, and joyful experiences that, that make people feel, activated and passionate and questioning about, who they are and what they're doing. It has a tremendous capacity for that as well. So I think the words intervention and you know, agitational, they kind of have this kind of quite angry kind of feel to them, but they don't have to be that.
You're totally correct, and I think this becomes the interesting thing because we're constantly bombarded by messages that tell us what to think.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually art is doing what it does best when it's ambiguous,
Yeah.
and it just forces you to think. I don't really care what you're going to think about, but I want to put you in a position where you need to think for yourself.
Yeah.
And there's different strategies to achieve that. Yeah. But you're totally right. I think that when you're becoming overly didactic, when you're trying to send your message in a way which is explicit, it's propaganda. It's not interesting as art any longer.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of interventions can be incredibly seductive and tell a story in a different way. You know, it just depends, you know, those ideas that you have that, and I agree, as long as you aren't getting someone to think, whether they're thinking about the wider world or the smaller world, or just the world that they're walking around in, enjoying. That's a really great insight.
We might take our last one Yep, good, we've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I think I've in the past generally held a sort of like, oh yeah, confrontation in art's great or whatever, but just thinking about these questions, it's like, what about, what's the distance between an art object and an artist that allows like an artist to create an art object, which is sort of their statement, that allows them to be like an asshole or something? Like, how do you, there's some kind of like distance that you sort of put between yourself and your creation. It's like, oh, I'm an angry bastard and I'm, you know, I'm punching all this stuff. And then it's like, you've distanced yourself almost in an ethical sense from this sort of object between your actual sort of like, but we see these objects as like our subjective kind of like conversation in the world. And I think there's some kind of implicit distance that there actually is, that we all take part in as artists, that we don't like to think of.
I think we have to really take responsibility in some ways, or at least I like to, because I mean, I'm kind of in a mode of putting things into the world that I like, that I want to see more of, and so that has been what's driven me into this sort of you know, ambiguous but kind of like in some ways utopian propositions, but in some ways much more ambiguous and nihilistic propositions that I create. But ultimately, any sense of futility that is in them is this sort of subtext rather than like big bombastic anger gestures. And I think that is because of a desire to see more, and also with the way that I live, to live in a way that is a little bit more affirmative, even though the work I make isn't necessarily affirmative. I want to do gestures that are sustainable and that create positive relationships with other human beings, even though I think that that's like, you know, futile and probably pointless. It just is nice to do.
Well, I think there's like almost, you know, the actual act of sort of an embodiment of something, even if it's its ultimate utility is futile. The reinforcement kind of is valuable, like you were saying, like
it makes my life better.
Yeah, the actual actions themselves.
I'm kind of reminded of this work, and I don't know if people know of it, but this artist Mark McGowan who ate a swan, for me it's kind of like the perfect example of an arsehole moment. Because, you know, I guess in a way the point he was trying to make was that only royalty are able to do this, and so, you know, he put himself in that position and he went through the action of eating that swan. And I guess my question would have been, what did you have to actually do that to actually to talk about this idea? And for me it was kind of, I kind of get what you're saying. It's kind of like this kind of blunt hammer moment where there's just no, there's nothing that I can think of with that work that makes me want to know more about it, or to even see it, or, you know, that Yeah.
But it left an impact in the world and you propagated.
I
know.
just that's why I was stumbling. I was like, I'm talking about it, damn it.
I really think that's really, and it's so nice when a work can be summarized in a single, like 5 sentences or 5 words, you know? Which is what is so brilliant about that proposition. But I think it's a really fine line when you're trying to illuminate hypocrisy through hypocrisy.
Yes.
And that is a, I don't know.
It's very effective.
Yeah, tell us more.
I exercise informed hypocrisy, and a lot of my work deals with that. But to answer your question, it's kind of interesting because a lot of my work deals with futile attempts to try to control complex systems around us, especially other living systems.
Yeah.
And by definition of trying to show that we can't control those systems, I have to also let go of my work, of whatever. But there's different layers in which I operate. So my objects as artworks, they stand for themselves, and they're more often than not are being totally misinterpreted, in my opinion. They're going to places which I would never even imagine they would go. And for me it's a success because I lost control over the discourse over this piece. Then I have the writing, usually I do it with Unite, my collaborator, and we write and we're a bit more explicit about it. And then there's the public appearances where I take a persona, it's a performance now. It's not me that you're talking to. You know, it's the performance of me as an artist talking to you as if I know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So I think that there's all of those different layers, and it can be embodied with one person, that you can use those different strategies in different places to do without a distance yourself from what you've done, or to try to bring the audience closer, and it's all legitimate. And I have many assholes.
And I think that there is a flip side, which is that I know lots of artists who have a really strong sense of ethics with their practice, and they don't bring it into their everyday life. And I think a lot of people are really, really comfortable with that, and they're just like, this is the way it has to be. But I think that, it's worth scrutinizing and considering, because there's a lot of ways where that starts to cheapen the work a little bit, if you ask me. So I don't know. That's just my.
We talked earlier about failure, and I don't know that piece about the swan, but I wonder if he was able to later reflect on that and go, that was a failure.
Right.
Maybe it shifted. Yeah. Because we do need to make, there's artful gestures that sometimes are just failures that we need to go on from and ask better questions,
or maybe the
more
whole
interesting questions.
Yeah. Sometimes it's defined as a person. So there's a Finnish artist who killed a cat.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name, but everyone refers to him as a Finnish artist. And he did so much more interesting work since. Yeah. No one really remembers that. Just the moment where he killed the cat.
Yeah. Maybe the whole point is so that the artist can laugh at all the people who think he's done a terrible gesture while they're eating their chicken dinners, and just reflect on that sort of delicious nuance in swan form.
It just sort of shows something about art in a way. Like when you look at a piece of art, you're aware that it's sort of like you're aware that there's an awareness in a sense. It's like, oh, he ate a swan, he must think it's wrong or something. You know what I mean? So, it's like, it's no different. He's still eating a swan. It's just, it seems that when it's in an art world, it's just critically engaged. It's just a way to make something critically engaged in a way, isn't that all the time, it seems?
Yeah, but again, it's the art has a special place because swan is more than just a food. If he would do it just because he was hungry and would go by the lake and cook a swan and no one would hear about it, the swan wouldn't be a swan.
Totally.
Duck tastes much better anyway. That's why we eat ducks instead of swans.
We've
chicken.
hit 8:30. Before we close it up, before I have a final little egress pattern conversation, is there anything that you guys wanted to do to kind of tie the bow?
I think we should all do an interpretive dance.
Great!
Sorry.
I'm staying with you. All right.
I've done your.
Asked me to perform like Dega on the stage at Walker. And collaborate. I went.
That's not your asshole moment.
It's not going to be me.
All right. On that note, then.
May I just?
Yes, absolutely. Please do.
Just remember, Perth is actually one of the most amazing places to do with this type of activity.
Yes.
And Kelli just won the major New Media Art Awards from the Australian Council. It's the second West Australian artist in the 2 years that they will be. So we're doing okay, and we should keep on pushing. So that's we're in the edge of the world, but we're doing well.
Fantastic. Guys, so this has been Amplifier Art Talk, Art vs Ethics, which I think we can take the question mark off now, and get rid of their versus. Is that?
What do we replace it with?
Right, no, let's not open it again. So this has all been, Propel Youth Arts will do more art talks as we go along. This is our third of this one, and as I say, it is part of National Youth Week. We do have 4 other forums as part of National Youth Week as well. So those are focused by our planning committee. That's sexual health, mental health, how to adult, and decoding the news, how to read between the lines. So please register for some of those talks and forums that are coming up. They'll be a very similar style and enjoyment level as this one. Can we please put our hands together to our panel?